Hi, everyone. Welcome to our leadership session. This is Sean Joyce. I'm the PwC Global and US Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Forensics Leader. And I'm excited to talk to you all about the role of security executives in building customer trust. Joining me today is Matt Gorham, Managing Director of PwC's Cyber Innovation Institute and the former assistant of the cyber division in the FBI. Also joining is Bob Moore. He's the former CEO of Eagle Dream Technologies, and currently he is the co-leader of PwC's Cloud and Cybersecurity Hub. So welcome, Matt and Bob. So today, Matt and Bob, we're going to talk about really how executives help build customer trust. And I think to really set the stage, we want to talk about the current environment. In a recent survey that PwC did, there were 21% of consumers who have a greater trust in business use of their data. 36% are less comfortable sharing information than they were a year earlier. And 85%, and I think that's the key figure right there, 85% wish they could trust more companies with their data. And I think we've also seen, and I think the events at the Capitol really highlighted this, the rise in disinformation and misinformation, which is a concern for business executives. In 2020, 16% of CEOs around the world were extremely concerned about misinformation as a threat to their growth. In 2021, that almost doubled, right? It went to 28% that were concerned about dis or misinformation. So, I think we're seeing a lot of these things that really are affecting the business environment. But one of the, I think, most critical and impactful factors is the threat of cybersecurity adversaries and their relation to how they can affect businesses in today's world. So, to start off, I think it would be great for all of our listeners to really hear about the current threat environment. And, Matt, I'm going to turn to you first, and not only based on your FBI experience, but looking ahead into the future. How do you see that threat landscape affecting businesses? And also, right, as we talk about customer trust, affecting that?
Sure. I think, Sean, in the last couple of years as the assistant director for cyber in the FBI, I oversaw all the investigations and operations into both nation state adversaries as well as criminal adversaries. And I think, if you look at those two big buckets and you think about the national security side of things first, you see nation states conducting what I'd call traditional espionage. That is, trying to collect the state secrets of another country, finding information out about the populace, about the way the economy works. But you also see other things from nation states. You see the theft of intellectual property. Um, you see the preparation for and access operations for cyber attack. That is, a nation state creating the access to utilize the attack should they find it in their strategic interest to do so, to dissuade another nation from doing something or to punish another nation for doing something in the future. And then lastly, on the nation state side, we saw hack and dump operations. That is, hacking into an organization, be it government or non government, and taking that information and really releasing it to try to have some impact either on the populace or the government. And I think those are the big four buckets of activity by nation states. But I think as companies look at that threat, they have to think of that not just in the cyber realm, but in the physical world too. If you think about cyber as kind of the easy button, that is, a nation state can sit in their own country and conduct those cyber operations. If they're unsuccessful in that space, then they may take some action that's more provocative or riskier on their part, and that is actually send individuals to do some of that same type of activity. So companies, certainly on the nation state side, need to think about the threat holistically, both cyber and in the physical realm.
When you say, Matt, you just mentioned they may send people, right, on the physical side. What do you mean by that?
I think we've seen companies that Let's look at traditional espionage activity, the first bucket I mentioned. If you think about the ability to sit in the capital of another country and collect information on the United States government or United States corporations or the United States public, if you're able to do that from the other country, it is a less provocative and a less risky proposition. However, if they are unable to do that, they could certainly send what we would think of as spies in kind of general parlance over, or somebody who is operating at the behest of a spy to provide that information. Kind of what you would think of kind of Cold War activity if you think back in time, the spy versus spy. I think, there are very few operations conducted by nation states today that don't employ both. That is, you see nation states employing cyber to facilitate their physical intelligence operations, and you see physical operations being used to facilitate cyber operations. And so they're so intertwined today that I think a company really needs to think about how are we protecting both realms and not creating cylinders of excellence and separate and apart.
So Matt, I think we've typically heard, right, that there was maybe quote unquote the big four of nation states. And you hear, like, do you see that activity increasing because the barriers to entry are relatively low? Or do you see this leveling off? Like, where do you see it going?
No, I think the big four countries engaged in this activity will continue. I think there will be some proliferation amongst other countries, and primarily because 20 years ago you had to be highly sophisticated to be a hacker. You actually had to be technical. Today, that capability, even in the criminal space, is available for sale. You can buy that capability. So countries that may not have the resources of some of the larger countries engaged in this space may be able to buy the capability and engage in that space.
So, continuing down, so you said nation states, is that sort of the greatest threat out there, or is it, criminals, hacktivists, others, or
I think from a sophistication perspective, the nation states are going to be the most sophisticated. And I think really what companies should be thinking about is, do I really understand those nation states, what they want, how they do it, um, and what I may have in my company that's of interest to them. And I think one of the ways you do that is, and we've talked about it a lot over the years, is that collaboration between government and the private sector. So I'd ask all companies, do you have a relationship with the government that helps flesh that understanding out with you? Do you have a relationship with the FBI, with the United States Secret Service, with CISA? I think all of those will help you understand that threat. But from a sophistication perspective, the nation states are absolutely the most dangerous threat.
hey, Bob, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. We certainly have seen a lot of movement or acceleration to the cloud. I expect 21 and the next several years to be big years. How do you see the threat against, cloud native companies and certainly companies on that journey?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, no, I think a lot of what Matt is saying, it becomes very, very critical for companies to really take it seriously. I mean, just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean that good architecture and good security doesn't matter anymore. So, I think what faces people is that they have to be worried about data breaches, and to Matt's point, how do you recover from a data breach, right? If you don't pay the ransom, you have to be able to recover. So I think a lot of the typical infrastructure related things need to be paramount. Um, the risks to access management in a multi-cloud environment, I think, comes to play as well. The modern company today is a collection of multi-clouds. You might have a public cloud provider, you might have Salesforce.com, you might have Workday, and things like that. So as you take a look at, from a threat vector, if you're able to, get into the access management, you're able to, potentially go across multiple systems very, very quickly. And I think it just elevates the conversation, Sean. I think it puts the chief security officer and the chief information officer is sort of at the strategic level now, much more aligned with the business, because to that point about customer trust, if you have a data breach, if you have a sensitivity loss, it can have much more dramatic effects to your client base that might be, irretrievable.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And Matt, kind of going back to you as we kind of talk about that threat environment, how do you see it changing or evolving over the next couple of years? And I think we've also heard, ESG is becoming a really a very important issue for many, many companies. How do you see that in the threat environment? And are there things we need to be concerned about from that perspective?
Sure. I think we're going to continue to see the rise in sophistication coming from nation states as cyber becomes a tool of national power and continues to be used. I think we'll be continue to be susceptible to that type of activity. In the criminal space, we certainly I would expect to continue to see a migration from actors that are conducting other type of activity to cyber because criminals operate where we live, where the money is, where we operate on a daily basis. And as cyber and the digital realm becomes more and more a part of our everyday existence, that's where criminals will continue to operate and find ways to manipulate the system to make money. I think as I think about those two, I worry a lot about the disinformation influence operations that may be conducted in that space. We have certainly seen it from nation state actors over the last 5 years or so, and increasingly so. More and more countries engaging in that space, and I could see a time where criminals may find ways to conduct operations to make money where they are trying to exert influence or put out disinformation or misinformation that would allow them to make more money. When I think about kind of what, in many cases, kind of gets lost on the cutting room floor, that kind of hacktivist activity that takes place, I think companies really need to think about that, particularly as we're thinking about governance and the issues of the day. If a company is not aligned and not conducting themselves the way that they are publicly articulating they're conducting themselves, I think that leaves them susceptible to individuals who may want to expose that activity. And just like you would think about a nation state going to do a hack and dump operation, are there hacktivists out there that would take your internal content and expose that content to show in their mind, hypocrisy between what a company says and what a company is actually doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's definitely, I think that's a great point, Matt. And I think we have really seen the threat environment, the sophistication level increase dramatically. I'm hearing from you it's going to continue to do that. And in parallel, I think we're also seeing that digital transformation also increase and rapidly change the way businesses operate. We've seen on many businesses that are going through digital transformation, the acceleration to the cloud is certainly one of the major things that's happening. And an interesting statistic that I found of a survey that we did on cloud adoption, where only 17% of over 3,200 respondents reported reaping the benefits of cloud adoption. I thought that was really interesting. 29% have implemented things but not yet realized benefits. And then 47% have started implementing and are planning to do so within the next year. So, certainly, right, when we talk about acceleration of the cloud, we've heard about moving to the cloud for several years. But I think really the pandemic has brought an inflection point of this digital transformation and specifically acceleration to the cloud. And with that comes, I think, a different customer experience, a different customer perspective. As you know, from a business perspective, they want to embrace everything a cloud brings with scalability, agility, and to give their customers the most out of an interaction. But this has also changed the dynamic between, I think, businesses and cloud providers. So it really is, it becomes, as I think Bob mentioned, almost this shared responsibility. So, Bob, turning to you, I really want to talk about this shared responsibility model and how that affects building customer trust. So, as CEO of Eagle Dream, you helped a lot of companies transform and actually move to the cloud. And I wonder if you could talk to our listeners just about how you help them with that journey, how you help them build and maintain that trust, and talk about that shared responsibility model.
I think the a common thread of everything we're talking about here is that the stakes of the security professional and the cloud professional have never been higher. I mean, the pandemic has shown us that cloud technology have enabled so many things. It's become not only ubiquitous, but almost taken for granted, right? Everything we do is at a touch of a button, or download this or upload that. So I do think that building and maintaining the trust of the stakeholders is paramount, for those security executives at their strategic level, to understand the customer value chain, understand where they fit, so that they can always be, this, trust but verify. But you've got to make sure you do the verification piece of it. As you understand your cloud landscape, because again, like I said earlier, today's modern infrastructure is not just a lift and shift of migrating your on-prem data center to a public data center. You might have AWS, Azure, GCP. You may have all three of them in your network, and you might have Salesforce. You might have, Oracle ERP. You might have SAP. All these different sorts of things together. So, is that's accelerating. And as you start to step back and take a look at how have I traditionally managed that? How do I have to evolve? When you talk about digital transformation, it's really, to me, and what our customers see is really this acceleration of innovation, especially over the last year. Customers and clients that were able to, hopefully they were already in the cloud. If they were already in the cloud, they had a dramatic head start. But it certainly has caused a dramatic amount of growth of not only cloud professionals such as ourselves that help customers grow, but also those companies themselves. And with that dramatic growth, you have a tendency to potentially let things fall to the back, or fall, as a less priority. And today you have a multi-instance of issues where not only you're accelerating, but the technologies with which the cloud provides you, it's not just infrastructure as a service anymore, where people can just put their applications in a virtual machine. It can be all the way to microservices. And so, the security teams have to aggressively have a posture about accepting and embracing that change.
I'm curious, do you see a lot of companies moving fast in the technology realm, but maybe from a security and trust perspective, not moving at the same speed or acceleration? Do you see, really that security by design model happening? Or I'm curious on your experiences with companies.
I think the statistics that you read off were pretty telling. I think as people embrace the cloud, there are people that have leveraged the cloud for a long time and are making the benefits. So they're farther along that maturity cycle. They understand, when you talk about shared responsibility, where they understand what they're responsible for above whatever line that their service they're getting from their cloud provider. People that are rushing into the cloud, and I think that's the big danger, that exposes a lot of these risks that Matt talked about, especially in the last year and a half, is you rush to the cloud and you turn up pilot programs and you turn up POCs that, unfortunately quickly turn into production systems. You're not necessarily architecting for security up front. You're not leveraging best practices. You're not doing the blast zones that within the cloud that's easy to architect. So I think that's important, and that make sure that you step back a minute, understand what you're trying to achieve with your digital transformation, but make sure that the security teams and the governance teams are right there in the midst of the conversation up front, because the time that the steps that you skip today, that technical debt will only build. And a lot of the vulnerabilities that we see with clients, and a lot of, quite frankly, the breaches or loss of data to this sensitivity stuff, the social aspects that Matt was talking about, come from misconfigurations. Leaving just basic things open in cloud configurations that they assumed that the cloud provider was handling for them, because they didn't necessarily have a good understanding of what was their responsibility in the cloud, what was the cloud provider's responsibility. And that, Sean, is becoming almost like a multi-dimensional matrix, right? Where you have sort of the vertical aspect of what level, what part of the OSI model you're really asking your provider to give you, but then also it sort of goes horizontally because these things are just exploding and it's exploding across multiple providers. So I think to your point is exactly right. Is that the security by design? I think that the push for innovation, I think the push to be to keep and retain customers, unfortunately, I think puts the security conversation a little bit to the back seat. We see because when we're involved post event, it's generally because a very simple thing was missed.
Talk to me or talk to all of us a little, Bob, about what's the role you talked about this, right? This shared responsibility. What is the role of each party in really enabling and building that customer trust we're talking about?
That customer trust is really a culmination of internal trust with each other. The technical providers within an organization, whether they're internal or third party or a mix of both. They really have to build trust with their stakeholders. The stakeholders have to trust that, and that sort of trust builds to ultimately the customer trusts the firm or the business with which that they're buying services from. So when you take a look at the stakeholders of the business push down and say, okay, we need to innovate, or maybe we're going to the cloud to cut costs, or going to the cloud to add more features. The IT teams are pushed in to push very quickly into the cloud models, and so you have to understand where your level of responsibility leaves, and it's different with respect to each provider. Each public cloud provider has different levels and different responsibilities with what you're doing. So let's say that you're deploying something in Azure, you may have different responsibilities than if you're deploying in AWS, as an example, which is certainly much different than if you're like leveraging Salesforce for your CRM and customer database. So if you're doing traditional infrastructure as a service where you're really relying on that provider to, just provide essentially a virtual machine for you, that's a typical lift and shift, which quite frankly is the majority of the cloud moves today. You still you retain all the responsibilities generally that you would have had before. And in fact, I would argue that your responsibilities actually got much more complex because now you have to worry about some of the underlying configurations and how your business deals with that cloud. And quite frankly, what are those third party risks? Like when we talk about, as an example, if someone uses a third party authentication mechanism and that gets compromised or ransomware or whatever, that has ripple effects through, the organization, even though your personal cloud or your public cloud wasn't taken care of. Now, as we accelerate into a digital transformation, and things like serverless computing and microservices and things become much more prevalent, especially, sort of this next generation of app builds is sort of accelerating. You go up the stack a little bit with respect to what the cloud provider provides for you is responsible for, which on the surface, again, makes it easier for the CIO or the CISO or the CTO or whatever to sort of, embrace that. But the issue that worries me a lot when I'm working with a client, it's not like it's all or nothing, right? You really have all of these things in the mix now of the infrastructure that you're responsible for. And to one of Matt's earlier points, the thing that scares our customers and certainly scared me, I was a public company CIO prior to building Eagle Dream. And the thing that always scared me was if that data that you had got out into the wild. There's a lot of secrets in that data, or there's a lot of sensitive information that can be used against the company. And so, as you're embracing all these various different pieces of cloud services available to you, you really have to take the time to understand what you're really responsible for. In some cases, you're responsible for continuing to patch the OS. You're responsible for, patching the databases. And then in other scenarios, you're really just responsible for just making sure that service is up, and you're just responsible for the data that goes in there. So, again, it's a continuum to me. As I start to make sense of it, Sean, it's really almost like this multi-dimensional matrix of where you are. And, every application, we're starting to see now where you may have a larger organization that may be a little late to the game with cloud. Maybe they have 300 applications and they say, okay, we want to modernize that one. Well, now it's even, so you say, okay, the best way to do that is maybe serverless computing. Well, now that CISO is responsible for not only their on-prem things, they're responsible now for newer technology that they may or may not be capable of handling or ready to handle. Now you got a network in between them. Now you got access across all of them. You have to start thinking about all those things, and it just starts exploding very quickly.
So, Bob, you make some great points there in really talking about that shared responsibility model between the cloud service providers and the companies. But I would proffer there's also another partner that shares responsibility, and that's the government and how they really support organizations in building customer trust. So, Matt, based on your experience, can you talk about how the public sector plays that role?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about what Bob was just describing, you're talking about something that's very complex, and what he's describing is a human endeavor. I think sometimes with technology, we think that it's an easy fix and we can have a technological fix to things, but in reality, there are humans engaged, and that means we're going to have to work together. It ensures that everybody's both dependent and independent at the same time. And so if you think about the ecosystem, if you have the defensive community on the left-hand side of that spectrum, 90% of the critical infrastructure in the United States controlled by the private sector with primary responsibility for defending it. And you think about the right-hand side of the spectrum, the parts of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, and you think about law enforcement, the FBI, the Secret Service, with respect to the military counterintelligence organizations like NCIS, Air Force OSI, and Army G2 operating in the center. How do you do things together? I think a way to think about that is really as individual threads in a woven fabric. We're trying to create a fabric, a protective blanket. And if we're not together, if we're not woven together tightly, then there are seams, and the adversaries that are out there, be they nation state or criminal, will take advantage of those seams. And so sharing information, particularly threat information, forming relationships early on. I mentioned before, do you have a relationship with the government? So if you're operating in this space, have you formed those relationships ahead of time? Because if you're going to want to have trust in that relationship, and it takes time to form that relationship because the basis of that is going to be transparency and predictability. And so you want to know, how will the government react if I make this phone call? The only way you're going to do that is pick up the phone well before an incident takes place, form that relationship, get to the point where you're sharing information back and forth. And that's really where the government can help you flesh out your understanding of the threat, talk to you about who the adversaries in detail are, what they want, how they do it, what you might have, so that you can make conscious risk decisions. And then when something does take place, have government there with you both in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of figuring out who those threat actors engaged in the activity are, and imposing some type of risk and consequence on those individual organizations or enterprises to stop that activity in the future. Deterring and dissuading someone from doing that activity in the future is something that will prevent additional attacks. So I think really it's got to be um, a good understanding of the threat picture. When you think about it, another analogy I often use are pieces of a puzzle. The government may have some pieces of the puzzle. The private sector, by virtue of the fact that private industry is the victim of the vast majority of this activity, is going to have other pieces of the puzzle. And the more of the pieces of the puzzle you can put down, the better you understand the threat environment, the easier it is for government to pick out those pieces of the environment that will have the greatest impact if removed from the puzzle.
Great points. And now we're talking this shared responsibility model, really trying to build trust. But when I hear from both you and Bob, right, two of the partners, the cloud service providers, big tech, and the government, are probably some of the least trusted entities. So how do they actually change that? Where is that opportunity for better collaboration? And I guess, Bob, I'll start with you. What do you think between the cloud service providers and companies? How do they actually collaborate better? and really to make that customer trust actually grow?
I think a lot of it is transparency, Sean. As I sit back and I listen to a lot of things that Matt's talking about, we had a customer whose infrastructure was hacked through a cloud. Their on-prem stuff was actually came from someone else's cloud across the border, and we learned a lot throughout that process. That particular public cloud provider learned a lot through that process. So I think sharing those things, I think being very open about it. I don't think it helps that as much as it's we talk about preserving the data sensitivity and what happens in data leaks. The fact of the matter is these leaks happen, and every one of them, I think, has a lot of forensics, a lot of lessons learned. And I think the more that we can openly talk about those things in the community of the cloud service providers, um, the more it brings attention to things. I think that what we were saying earlier about the shared responsibility piece, where it's one thing to just publish a white paper and say, okay, if you're turning up some, VMs, this is what you're responsible. This we're going to take care of from everything here down, and you're responsible for that. You read a couple of lines and you go. But I think when you talk through much more openly about, things that can happen, really talk about the dangers of leaving certain things. We've all had customers that have been, potentially had some data loss, and when you go back and look at it, maybe they left some ports open on a firewall, and maybe the customer thought that the provider was responsible for that firewall because it's in the cloud, and the provider says, no, 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 you were responsible for that because it clearly talks about it in this third or fourth bullet down. So I think much more transparency, I think will help that. I do think the government, has sort of a role to play as far as potentially talking through a lot of these things, because to Matt's point, making sure that the large companies have that direct relationship with their federal institutions is important. But I think the big three cloud providers can also help facilitate some of that, where instead of not wanting to talk about when bad things happen, but just embracing the fact that when bad things happen, here's how we're going to help you. I think can also bring it much more to a professional level conversation. I mean, I think if you talk to a Linux administrator, today that built, 20 years as an on-prem infrastructure managing Oracle databases, I'm sure they can talk at the top of their agenda of the top 5 things that they worry about every time they set up a new infrastructure. Every time you set up a cloud, almost it evolves and it continues to evolve. It's an evolving skill. So I do think transparency is going to help a lot, John.
And Matt, from the public sector side, that the opportunity to collaborate and build that trust, do you see? You've only been out now, what, a couple of months. You know, what do you think we could do differently or better to really change that model and really make the customers' trust grow?
I think along the lines of what Bob was saying, I've seen two really good examples of where private industry and government sit side by side. So the National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance in Pittsburgh and the National Defense Cyber Alliance in Huntsville, Alabama are both examples of where private industry is sitting side by side with government. That cybersecurity information is not looked at as competitive advantage, but that everybody realizes we're all dependent on one another engaged in this activity. And so the sharing of that information it is done. And I think that, to me, when I look at that, it says a couple of things. One, that people are going to sit down side by side, be transparent, form the relationship over time. And as a result of that, you see those as very successful. I think what I'd really like to see, based on my experience over the last, almost 26 years, has been that we really need to form those relationships, both at the national level with a lot of the big companies, but at the local level with some of the medium-sized and smaller companies as well. And that really is a relationship. It's easy to say government's at fault or government isn't able to provide me what I need. But my question is always going to be, well, have you sat down with government and had that conversation? Because what I found over the course of my time in government was that there were many people that were hesitant to call government the first time, but there were very few people that were hesitant to call government the second time based on the positive experience they had when they did call. And so if you form that relationship, I think companies will be more likely to call because it's a trusted partner in government. You're not calling, the FBI switchboard. You're calling an individual that you know and trust and have had conversations with. And I know those are baby steps towards where we need to be. But I think that's a good starting point, is to form those relationships, understand who you're talking to, that it's an actual person, and then continue to develop that over time.
Right. So, I think what I've heard from both of you is really in this shared responsibility model between the cloud service providers, the companies, and the government is really I'm hearing transparency and then also building those relationships. And in turn, by building trust in that shared responsibility model, we're also building the customer trust. And that can become a true, I think, strategic differentiator. And I'd be interested, Matt and Bob, have you seen companies where that has become part of their brand or has really made a difference? So I guess to you first, Bob.
When I was a public CIO, um, I love to be taken for granted. And what I mean for that was, when it's sort of like what Matt was saying, is that people don't have a relationship with you unless bad things happen and then they call you that one time. And then it's very easy to sort of armchair quarterback. I think brands that we take for granted every day are the ones that really take advantage of making sure that they understand they've accepted a responsibility. They have teams that work, whether it's internal infrastructure teams working with third-party cloud and security providers. Whether it's they have a good rate relationship with their government counterparts. But at the end of the day, the ones that grow, the logos and the names and the brands, everything we shop for, especially today more than ever. I know at our house, the Amazon and UPS and FedEx trucks never stop coming. And the last time we stepped foot in a mall was maybe 15 months ago. So, those brands are the ones that are becoming much, much more trusted. And it's because they know how strategic all of that infrastructure, whether it's hybrid cloud, totally public cloud, SaaS offerings, whatever, is so important to how they're running their business, that they've put those people that manage those situations at the strategic stakeholder level in the organization. And that enables them, so the fact that we take those things for granted, that we push a button, I think speaks a lot to that public trust, because, you pick your XYZ, e-commerce retailer. We trust when we push a button and we order shoes or we order car parts or whatever it is, because we haven't seen them in the news or the Wall Street Journal.
Right. Matt?
Yeah, I think I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage in that I don't want to talk about particular companies based on my experience in the FBI. I don't think that would be fair, but I think they can speak for themselves, certainly. I think what I've seen over time is those companies that formed a relationship and developed that trust with government, when an incident did occur, and incidents will occur, that they were able to handle it and provide public statements as to what they were doing and how they were doing it. Certainly, particularly, I can speak for the FBI, is very happy to talk to regulators and other organizations after the fact that say how a particular company cooperated and worked with government, which can sometimes have a positive effect and impact. And so I think, you know, if you are dealing with an incident, and you will have an incident, there's no doubt that it is your ability to have a trusting relationship with government will shape how the public perceives your actions after the fact. And if you don't have that relationship and you haven't had that ability to work with government after the fact, I think that will impact the way you're perceived by the public as well.
That's a great point, Matt. And I really think a lot of companies are now looking at this strategically and how does really building that customer trust make a difference. But I think we've also seen other forces, and specifically investors who are, maybe picking a company based on that organization's principles or values, or relating it to sort of the ESG impact that it will have. So I think we're seeing multiple forces in the market really affect this. And in our sort of what we do, I think we've seen, from a data privacy perspective and an overall security perspective, that this is becoming an important topic, not only in the C suite, but in the boardroom. And I want to highlight a recent CEO survey that PwC did, where 42% of all US CEOs wanted to do more to measure their ESG impact through cybersecurity and data privacy. So I think that's really a key statistic there. And I kind of go to both you, Bob and Matt. Do you think that can play a role as far as, ESG being another force where it's changing the way companies look at customer trust?
I would say absolutely. The social piece of it, right? I mean, you could have the best brand in the world for 50 years, and one bad piece of social, and for to what Matt said very early on in our discussion, having people that are going after these things because they want the ransomware, sort of the bigger the prize, finding these deep dark secrets. Boards can't afford, and larger the corporation and the older they've been in business, the more issues they potentially have to uncover. So I think that, being very, very sensitive to what could the ramifications of something happen can certainly drive. And I think it also speaks to the fact that for companies that have very little of those things exposed, speaks to how well operated they are. Because I think we all take a little bit for granted data breaches. It seems like they're out there a lot in our credit cards and things like that. But I think the more squeakier clean a company is, the more the boards or the investors can certainly feel better about those investments.
Yeah, Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I think for me, it really goes back to that analogy about the fabric is how woven together is the operational strategy of the company we're talking about with their cybersecurity strategy. Are they operating together? Do the boards, do the executives in the company understand the totality of that risk, and are they making decisions that in hindsight, will appear to have really been conscious, smart decisions about what that risk looks like. Because I think that's where the vulnerability is in the 2020 hindsight of after the fact is not a time to expose that the companies weren't integrated together in that ecosystem the way they really needed to be.
That is, I think, a very important message about integrating that strategy. But Bob and Matt, I think what I'm hearing is some key themes through our discussion of how we can really, as security executives, build that customer trust. And the first one is, Bob, I heard you mention it: trust through transparency. In organizations really getting a better understanding of customers' expectations from a trust building perspective and what they can do from a security and privacy of the customer data to really build that trust. The second thing I'm hearing, and Matt, you've touched on it multiple times, Bob mentioned it too, is really that building customer trust can't be done alone. It's really a combination, that shared responsibility model that we talked about, and really coming together and integrating, Matt, as you said, not only kind of operational strategies, but I would say overall sort of making sure we build those relationships with cloud service providers and the public sector. And then I think the last one we touched upon a little bit is really how does an organization make that part of what they're doing and really building it within their culture and making it part of their fabric and a true strategic differentiator. So, hey, listen, Matt, Bob, I wanted to thank you both for a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I hope our listeners enjoyed it.